Thank you for tuning into another video from JRM Recaps. Today we will be discussing the dark action film, Blade, which was one of the first successful comic book movies developed by Marvel. Hope you enjoy. Spoilers ahead. It's 1967 and we open to a pregnant woman being admitted to a hospital. It appears she has been bitten by an animal, and she is losing a lot of blood. The doctors have to move quickly to save the baby, so they perform an emergency C-section, and a baby boy is born. Unfortunately, the mother does not make it. We cut to the next scene, 30 years later. We follow a man named Dennis and his attractive companion named Raquel, heading to an underground nightclub somewhere in Los Angeles. After arriving at a meat-packing plant, they make their way to the back where they find two guards watching an entryway. Raquel communicates with the doorman in Russian and brings Dennis inside. This is Dennis' first time at the club, but he is surprised at how unfriendly everyone is. Suddenly the sprinkler system goes off and blood starts raining down on the crowd. Dennis quickly learns that everyone inside is a vampire. While trying to get away and break free, Dennis is shoved to the ground. He ends up at the feet of a dark, badass-looking character in a trench coat that the vampires refer to as the Daywalker. We are now introduced to Blade, the vampire hunter. We then see Blade start to dispose of the vampires in the club with ease using a shotgun and silver stakes. Blade wraps up the fight by pinning a heavy-set vampire named Quinn to the wall and lighting him on fire. Next, he confronts Denise, checking him for bite marks, but when none are found he lets him leave as the police show up. The police arrive on the scene and extinguish Quinn's body. He is then taken to a local hospital for examination. There, a morgue technician named Curtis and his supervisor, Dr. Karen Jenson, examine the body and find extremely weird abnormalities. Suddenly, Quinn regains consciousness and attacks them. He kills Curtis, but before he can finish off Jenson, Blade appears and cuts off one of Quinn's arms before the vampire can escape. Concerned for her well-being, Blade decides to bring Jenson back to his hideout to help her. There he enlists the support of his mentor, Whistler, who injects a serum made of garlic and silver nitrate to help stave off the infection. Meanwhile, a board of high-ranking vampires are discussing what to do about Blade. Here we meet the vampire Deacon Frost, who is the owner of the nightclub. Frost envisions a future in which the vampires enslave the human race and use them as a food. He is perceived as arrogant and his actions tend to draw attention to their existence. More seasoned vampires, such as Dragonetti, prefer to maintain the current order where man and vampire coexist. Dragonetti also looks down upon Frost because Frost is not a pureblood. You could say there is some bad blood between them. It's okay, I know you smiled at that one. Anyway, Jenson wakes up the following morning and begins to snoop around the lair. Jenson tries to get away, but does not get far. She is then told about the vampire underworld, and given a backstory about Whistler and Blade, who are vampire hunters. Whistler explains that Blade was the baby we saw in the opening scene. His mother had been attacked by a vampire hours before he was born. She died but Blade lived. Due to the unique circumstances of his birth, Blade is half man, half vampire. He has enhanced strength and healing abilities, just like other vampires, but none of their weaknesses. Except, however, their thirst for blood. Blade takes Jenson to her apartment so she can pack a bag and leave town. While there, a police officer arrives and tries to question her about the events at the hospital prior to attacking her. Blade returns just in time and subdues the officer. He then sees that the officer has been marked as a slave and is the property of Deacon Frost. Blade decides to let the officer go so he can use him as bait. The officer unknowingly leads them to a new underground location. They sneak inside and come face to face with Pearl, an obese vampire who works as a record keeper. Pearl confesses that Deacon Frost is researching the prophecy of La Magra, which is an ancient vampire ritual that is supposed to unleash the blood god. Meanwhile, Jenson has had enough and decides to burn Pearl severely with Whistler's giant UV light while Blade steals part of Pearl's hard drive. While making their way through the lair, they are suddenly ambushed by a group of vampires led by Quinn, who has since healed and grew back his lost hand. Quinn tortures Blade for information and for his own amusement, but realizes that Blade has a radio link in his ear and has been stalling for time. Whistler suddenly arrives by blowing a hole in the wall and opens fire on the vampires. Blade cuts off Quinn's other hand, and the three of them escape through the subway system by catching a passing subway train. Inside the subway car, Jenson notices Blade is acting weird until he injects himself with the blood alternative serum. Back at the hideout, we learn that Whistler's attempt to cure Jenson did not work and she is slowly turning into a vampire. Jenson refuses to give up and decides to look for a cure for both her and Blade. While conducting research, she discovers that an anticoagulant formula known as EDTA is found to have a violent reaction when mixed with vampire blood, so she gives it to Blade as a weapon. Meanwhile, Frost decides to put his secret plan into motion. His gang abducts Dragonetti, taking him to a beach just before sunrise and forcibly ripping out the elder vampire's fangs. When the sun comes up, they watch as the elder catches fire and burns to death, while Frost's gang shields themselves with sunscreen, heavy clothing, and motorcycle helmets. Frost then meets with the remaining elders of the Vampire Council, asking for 12 people to volunteer for his La Magra project. Blade leaves the hideout so he can get some more supplies. Whistler and Jenson are hard at work and finally discover a cure. Jenson is sure that the new formula will work on her since she did not turn yet, but is unsure how it would affect Blade since he was born a vampire. Suddenly, the stronghold is attacked by Frost's men. Jenson is captured while Whistler is bitten and beaten by the vampires. Blade returns to find his old friend injured and infected. Blade, in a very emotional state, assists his friend in ending his misery. He then loads up on weaponry as he sets his sights on Frost. Blade attacks Frost's home and easily defeats the majority of Frost's men. Blade makes his way through the building and finally reaches the back room of Frost's hideout. Here, he finds a woman who calls him Eric. It turns out to be Blade's mother, who was reborn as a vampire to serve Frost. Frost appears out of nowhere and ambushes Blade, taking him hostage while revealing himself to be the one that bit Blade's mother while she was pregnant. Frost takes Blade and Jenson to another location, a temple where he will begin the ritual of La Magra. While imprisoned, Jenson lets Blade know she created a cure, however she lets him know if he takes it he will lose all his powers, but become 100% human. Jenson is then taken away and thrown into a dungeon underneath the temple. Here, she finds her colleague Curtis, but he has somehow transformed into a zombie. Jenson manages to fight him off and climb out of the area. Elsewhere, the ritual for La Magra begins. We finally learn that through the ritual Frost will turn himself into La Magra, the blood god. The ritual calls for the blood of a daywalker and 12 pure blood vampire sacrifices. Blade is placed into a large torture device, which is used to extract blood from him. The 12 members of the council are then executed and their souls are absorbed by Frost, starting his transformation. Jenson makes her way to Blade and frees him. He is very weak and unable to fight due to all the blood he lost. In order to help him recover quickly, Jenson offers to have Blade feed on her blood. He resists at first, but finally sees no other choice and bites Jenson. Blade quickly recovers and feels stronger than ever before. Blade's mother suddenly appears looking to fight her son. The two battle, but she is ultimately defeated when she is stabbed in the heart with a bone. Blade fights his way through the remaining vampire guards, reclaiming his trademark sword and decapitating Quinn to reclaim his sunglasses. Blade then disposes of the remaining guards until it is time to fight Deacon Frost, aka the Blood God, one-on-one. The two engage in combat using their swords. Blade's elite skills prove to be no match for the Blood God, and he ends up cutting off its arm and slicing it in half. However, the Blood God's power allows him to regenerate almost instantly with a new arm growing back and his body reconnecting. The Blood God then showcases his newfound ability and starts laying waste to Blade. After taking a few devastating blows, he looks up and notices that the EDTA formula that Jenson created is hanging from a crack in the wall. the blood god mocks Blade, thinking that he is looking for his serum as a source of food versus a weapon. Blade uses his sword to knock down the vials of EDTA and then proceeds to throw them at the blood god. He connects with all the vials, and the formula causes a chain reaction that makes the blood god swell up and ultimately explode. Exhausted, Jenson and Blade exit the building. Blade lets Jenson know that he will not take the cure, and that his job of hunting vampires is not done, and he still needs his abilities. Instead, Blade requests that Jenson create a more effective serum, and she agrees. Finally, the movie ends with Blade resuming his hunt for vampires in a Russian-speaking country. Thank you for watching our recap. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit the thumbs up button and subscribe for future videos. Also, try some of our other videos displayed on screen.